StoryHinge, Episode 70, Adam Booth, Traditional Storytelling.
Traditional stories and folktales help us root, and ground ourselves into lessons and ways to act within society. And I think this is a time right now when we're really hungry for those stories. So it wasn't just necessarily extemporaneous storytelling. It was using words and approaching them and approaching connection with the audience as an art form. And that really stuck with me, and so I heard all these different storytellers, several that stick in mind. And as I was driving back home, I thought, that's what I want to do. I have to do anything that I can to get to the point. That's all that I'm doing. Yeah, and as an artist, I have this ego, that I want to have this grand career. I want to, win lots of awards and travel all over the world. But what I found is, as much as I love doing any of that stuff, the greatest reward comes from, telling to children and inspiring their creativity.
Welcome to StoryHinge. At StoryHinge, we explore foundational ideas and beliefs. We believe everyone has a beautiful story to grow. Now here's your host, Jason Vidaurri.
All right, everyone, welcome to StoryHinge. Real excited today. Today we have on Adam Booth. Now, Adam Booth is, I frame it as a traditional storyteller. He tells a blend of traditional mountain folklore, music, and an awareness of contemporary Appalachia. And it is a pleasure to be able to talk to someone who not only knows story, but does it in an art form and really is able to touch audiences through that art. So with all that, Adam Booth, welcome to StoryHinge.
Hi, thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. We were talking a little bit before I started the recording and talking about my interest in story, and I've gotten involved with more of the, I guess I view it as traditional oral storytellers here in Houston. And I reached out to you because you're one of those, and I guess in a unique way, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to hear about that. But I guess, first give us a little background into yourself, a little bit your, maybe some of the upbringing, some of those things that led you down the storytelling path.
Sure thing. It's important for me to establish where I'm from in order to inform the types of stories I tell and the storytelling traditions that I grew up with. So I'm from West Virginia, and I grew up in Huntington, West Virginia, and just outside of that city. And that's in the northern part of the southern coalfield, West Virginia, a very pretty rural area. And now I live in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, which is still a very rural area. The town where I live has less than 2,000 people, but we're also considered part of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area because I live pretty close to D.C., just an hour and 15 minutes or so to get into D.C. But I'm a West Virginian, and I tell Appalachian stories, and I tell stories influenced by my Appalachian upbringing, which I'm sure you'll probably ask me about more of that, but that's a little introduction to me as a storyteller.
Okay. When did you start thinking about storytelling as a career path in a real way? How'd that happen?
Well, yeah, so I grew up around a lot of storytelling, but I didn't think of it as a career path into an adult. When I was in college, the first 2 years of college I did at a school here in West Virginia, and I took this great class in Appalachian culture. I did a report on a storytelling contest, the West Virginia Liars Contest. And as I was researching this contest report, I was taken back to my childhood there in Huntington and outside of Huntington, where I grew up with a lot of storytelling. So storytelling was very much a part of my childhood. It was very much a family activity for us to tell stories and to listen to stories from other people in the family, particularly from my great-grandmother and her sister. But, really from a lot of people in my family, we would go and listen to them tell stories. So as an adult, as a college student, was researching that contest, and I thought of all those stories I'd heard when I was growing up, and I thought, well, I could try this out. So I began to compete in that contest, and it was after the second time that I won it, one of the tellers who I had studied, a man by the name of Bill, and he said, I do this for a living, and I'm around a lot of people who do this for a living, and you might be able to do it. He said, I think you've got what it takes, so you should think about it, and if it interests you, check out the National Storytelling Festival, and you'll see how people are using storytelling not just to make a living, but to preserve culture and tradition and speak about community. And it was around that time that I started to take this more seriously and think about it as a profession. And I did go to the National Festival and I was hooked. I said, this is it. This is what I'm going to do.
You talked about hearing stories, from your, I guess it was your grandparents or great grandparents, and having that childhood. What did those stories? I guess a little bit. What were those stories like, and what did they do for you in your youth?
That's a good question, and usually not one that people ask. So, I heard stories from my great grandmother, my dad's mom's mom, and her sister, and they were great storytellers. And the stories that they told were family stories. They were great at keeping family history, and they knew all these relatives, extended relatives, and cousins, and folks who had married into the family, and whenever we would spend time with them, they would just tell stories about those people, what they had heard was going on in their lives. And they would tell us stories about what it was like when those people were growing up, because they were really family historians. But also, those two stories about generations that had come before them. And so they would tell us stories about those people too. And so I had a lot of history passed down, and the people in my family were some of the earlier folks to settle in that part of West Virginia. I should say some of the earlier white people to settle in that part of West Virginia, which back then was Virginia, before it became a state. So I heard lots of family stories, and those stories were often adventure stories. Stories about doing things out in the woods and building rafts and going on rafting trips and logging timber camps and stuff like that.
Okay, very good. So you mentioned going to I think you said the National Storytelling, and that's when you were hooked. Let's hear about that again, and how you knew, hey, this is really something I want to do.
Yes. So in 2006, as I mentioned, the name Bill Lepp, he had suggested me to check out the National Storytelling Festival, which is in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And I trust Bill and respect him a lot. And I said, okay. So I went down to Jonesboro, not really knowing what I was getting into. And it was just an experience unlike any I've had before. And folks, will say the first year you go to the National Festival is an experience that sticks with you forever. And it really was. For me, it was an opportunity to hear storytellers that were representing different groups of people from around the country and sharing those stories. And it was an opportunity to hear stories that tellers who were working as artists had crafted into pieces. So it wasn't just necessarily extemporaneous storytelling. It was using words and approaching them and approaching connection with the audience as an art form. And that really stuck with me, and so I heard all these different storytellers, several that stick in mind. And as I was driving back home, I thought, that's what I want to do. I have to do anything that I can to get to the point. That's all that I'm doing.
Wow, that sounds pretty cool. And I guess, was there any particular storytellers out there that really touch you, or you maybe even continue to follow?
And also some that have passed over since that time. One in particular is Catherine Windham, this great storyteller from Alabama. I remember hearing her that first time I went, and I was so drawn to the way she spoke and the way she thought and the traditions that she kept and that she shared in the form of personal stories, which was really interesting to me. And also the history that she kept, the history of voices that didn't, I should say, the history of people whose voices weren't always allowed to speak in the South.
Uh-huh.
And so I was really drawn to her, and I followed her around that festival, and every time after that I went to Jonesboro until she died, I made sure to hear her tell. She's one that really stood out to me in that first time that I went.
Okay. So how did you do it? Because it sounds like a nice dream to have. Well, yeah, listen, I'd love to do this storytelling for a career, but that seems like quite a leap to actually make it happen.
Yeah, it sure is. It's a big leap. So I, for a few years, thought about how to structure a business as a storyteller. And it wasn't too far of a leap from what I was doing. I'm a musician, and I went to school to study music composition and musicology. And at that time, I was teaching. I was just out of school, and I was teaching at a university as an adjunct. But I had this a little bit of business sense in my mind from the classes I'd taken for being a freelance composer. And I just needed to start to apply those to being a storyteller and, kind of rework, to turn the dials, as it were, over to an independent artist. I had a lot of advice given to me from other storytellers. I had a few people take me under their wings to help me out. But, there were a lot of trials and errors that I had to go through. I had to learn about budgeting for a business and travel and how to book and how to promote myself through, web materials, but also print materials. And so it's been a long journey, to be honest. Some people think that you just wake up one day and you start telling professionally, and that is not at all how it works. So I had a lot of part-time jobs along the way in helping me get there. But when I was going to turn 30, I thought this is the time. At that point, I had put in about 8 years of professional part-time storytelling. And I thought, I've really practiced my chops. I've got a pretty good repertoire at this point. I've had a lot of good mentorship. This is the time to let things go, and see if I can do it, because I'm not really committed to anyone or any particular area. And so I did. I cut ties to all my friends. Have not looked back since then. I've been a full-time professional teller now for 5 years.
Okay. So I guess I'm curious on your own art and storytelling. How did you develop that, and how did that get developed, and what did you do to get better as a storyteller over that time?
Well, I practiced a lot, and it's just practicing telling the stories, but it's practicing composing stories and thinking about structure. I'm always thinking about, because I take storytelling as an art, I'm always thinking structure and composition and weight and balance and voice and things like this within a story. So I spent a lot of time studying with people. I still do that, and listening to people speak about art. So I practice in that way. I also had to think about how to develop a repertoire that was able to share my voice. And what that has meant or come to me, for me, is how can I speak as a marginalized person, and how can I use my stories to represent marginalized communities? Mm-hmm. And first and foremost for me, that's Appalachia. How can I speak and tell stories about Appalachia? Because for a long time there have been stories told about Appalachia by people from the outside who have a misunderstanding of what this place is and who the people are here. And another thing was, how can I, make myself somewhat independent on the circuit of storytelling? At first I was telling a lot of tall tales. That's how I got my start. And I came to the realization that we already had a really successful male, white, tall tale teller from West Virginia. And that was Bill Lepp, that guy that I mentioned earlier, who I'd studied eventually. And I thought, I will never out Bill Lepp. So I have to find some place, I have to find a niche myself. And so, that was thinking about telling traditional stories and also working on new fiction, thinking about what the new stories from Appalachia are and how I can tell those. So all that came together to figure that out.
That's pretty cool. And what's unique about your Appalachia story and storytelling? What makes you unique then?
I try to tell stories, at least in my original fiction that's based on traditional stories. I try to tell stories about Appalachians that you wouldn't necessarily hear stories about. So underrepresented people in Appalachia, we're often thought of as being primarily a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant area, or a white heteronormative Scots-Irish area. And there's so many more people in Appalachia to that. So, I try to tell stories about valiant women from the region. I try to tell stories about community organizers. I try to tell the stories about people who live here that are fighting industries from the outside that are extractive industries, or try to tell the stories of people from the LGBTQ community within Appalachia, or folks who don't have white skin, from Appalachia. I try to be a voice for those communities, religious minorities within this region. I try to have characters that all those people in the original stories that I create.
I guess, why is that important to you to represent the less represented?
Well, it's important to me because I am some of those things. And, in listening to people tell stories about Appalachia, they often were telling stories that weren't about me. And, I want that representation. And I grew up with a number of people that don't fit the stereotype of Appalachian. And so I want them to have representation as well. And a lot of people have invested into my development as a storyteller. So I feel like I should use that investment to share stories about people from this region.
Okay, great. And maybe I want to go back. I guess this question is still in my mind, and this comes from, some of my audience are people out there looking for their next thing, the next step. Maybe it's a more creative project. Maybe it's a hobby on the side. And you described when you went to the story festival that you are, I'm not sure the exact words used, but that you knew that this was your thing. How did you decipher that? You got any helps for people maybe out there looking for their own thing?
Well, yeah, maybe.
This is a hard one, huh?
It's tough to quantify because, sometimes something inside of you speaks to you, or something from the outside speaks to a place inside of you that you didn't realize was there. And as you explore it, you realize this is why I'm here. This is what I meant to do. And I had one of those moments. I'm working really hard up to that point to try to tell a lot of stories and to get seen and heard anywhere that I could. But once I went to the National Festival, part of that awakening or that realization was there is this huge community out there across the country and beyond that loves to listen to stories and loves to tell stories. And there was so much more to it than I had understood up to that point. And, where I was thinking, well, if I get this many gigs per year where I can tell this many tall tales, then I might be able to make a living. All that changed because it suddenly was, now I want to find the ways to share my stories and spread the stories about who I am and who my people are. And also it is a career. I was flipping the direct. It was, now I'm going to make art and share it. I'm also going to make my living doing this. Of course, like I said, there was a lot of hard work in figuring out how to do that, but it was that moment where I could see that it could be done. It was possible.
That's cool. Okay. And so that happened again. What year was that?
That was 2006.
Okay, so a few years ago. And
yeah.
So how has it, I guess, the storytelling world that you see or been a part of, how has that changed over that time period? Or has it changed? Has it grown? Has it shrank? What's going on in the storytelling world?
Well, I think there's a couple of storytelling worlds out there. One of the biggest changes that I've seen in this period of time that I've been doing it is the growth of Moth style storytelling and story slams and that type of storytelling. Which, I was not, that wasn't my world initially, and it's still really not my world. It's a different circle than the one that I run in, but it has really brought a lot of young people to storytelling and helped a lot of young people develop the ability to listen to people that aren't like them. So that's a big change that I've seen, and it is somewhat related to the quote unquote platform storytelling world that I often work in. Because that is a model that developed an audience really like in the 70s and 80s, and that audience aged with the model, and there haven't been a lot of younger audience members or voices to come into that community. So I've seen that one start to age out and die off. So I'd like to find some place in the middle for those two things. And, I think some of my storytelling is trying to help with that. So that's one of the changes that I've seen. In the world of platform storytelling, I've seen a bit of a shift since, say 2006 or a little before it, where there had been a big emphasis on personal storytelling, which is what we see at the Moth, but we also saw it at a lot of storytelling festivals. And there has been a shift in the last few years to go back. The pendulum has swung back toward traditional stories and folk tales. And I think that there's a lot of reasoning behind that, some of which has to do with shift in politics across our country, because traditional stories and folk tales help us root, and ground ourselves into lessons and ways to act within society. And I think this is a time right now when we're really hungry for those stories.
Okay. I guess what is the main difference then between I think some people are probably familiar with the Moth, that kind of storytelling versus the kind of storytelling you do?
Yeah, so the Moth is built upon a slam model, like a poetry slam model, which is a little older than the story slam. And in that, usually within a people will gather together. There will be a theme for the gathering that guides the stories. And in a true slam style, people that want to tell stories will put their names into a hat or a cup. And as the names are pulled out, they get to go up and then tell a story in front of everybody. And generally, these are people that are not seen as professional storytellers. These are just story enthusiasts, or people that spin a good yarn or have the gift of gab. And if it happens to be a contest, then at the end of the event, the people in the audience will vote. So the audience picks a winner. And sometimes these events, like the Moth or Story Arts DC or Mass Mouth up in Massachusetts, there are many of these around the country. Some of those are connected to each other, so that as a champion from each event is elected, then all those champions come together and compete for like a grand champion title. That's a bit different from the work that I do, whereas usually I'm invited to a particular event, a school, a university, a festival, a library, something like that, to represent a particular type of storytelling and to entertain and to teach. So it's not extemporaneous. I prepare a program that I come and share. There are some extemporaneous qualities to it, but it's not like 2 seconds before I step on stage, my name's drawn out of a hat. They say, now come up and tell us stories. It's a bit different that way.
Yeah. And so what are some of the impacts you've seen from your storytelling over the years? Do you have any specific stories about how maybe an impact happened?
Well, now that I've been doing it for some time, I find that the work that I do in schools is having a bit of an impact. And, I made a conscious decision a while back that I would devote a lot of my work to telling to children, and making that as accessible as possible, particularly if a school didn't have the money to pay for it. And the benefit to that, what you reap after time, is that students, often in my case in remote or really rural areas, have the opportunity to reach the outside in a way that they wouldn't have had before. And they get an interest in storytelling, and they start to build their abilities to listen to each other and have a curiosity for what it means to be a citizen. And so I'm at the point in my career now where I'm starting to hear back from some of these students that I've told stories to. Some of them last year, some of them from a few years ago, and that's a pretty neat thing for me. That's a pretty neat impact that the work that I'm doing can have.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's cool.
Yeah,
because I don't know if there's anything as powerful as a good story.
Yeah, and as an artist, I have this ego, that I want to have this grand career. I want to, win lots of awards and travel all over the world. But what I found is, as much as I love doing any of that stuff, the greatest reward comes from, telling to children and inspiring their creativity.
Yeah, that's cool. So So why give us a little picture of what is a day-to-day, what your career life looks like these days?
Well, that depends on the day. So just to give you an example of what my life has been the last couple weeks, I'm in a period right now where I'm traveling quite a bit. So I was on tour throughout West Virginia and Tennessee. I headlined a big festival in Cleveland, Tennessee, just outside of Chattanooga. I came home and did some more work here. Then I went out to Utah. I worked in a theater company for a week as a storytelling resource artist for 2 new plays. Then I came back home. I went to South Carolina. I came back. I'm here for like 2.5 days. And I leave for Texas right after this. Then I come back home. I run a concert series. It's a storytelling concert series. So in between all this, I'm, working on booking storytelling artists, making sure all the arrangements are made. I do all my own contracting. So I'm also writing contracts for myself every day, communicating with different venues, making sure little details like, do I need to bring my sound system for this? What are the ages of the listeners? Are there certain things you don't want me to tell? Can I tell ghost stories? Do you want to hear traditional stories? I'm on the phone and email with different venues for all that type of thing. And still trying to maintain, a personal life as well.
No, that sounds like a true. It sounds like very much like an entrepreneur out there, crafting and making things happen. And
yeah, I am. That's what it is.
Yeah,
Entrepreneur. And I also do some coaching. So in the midst of all that, these last few weeks, when I've been home for a few days, there's a professor at a university here in the state that has hired me to do some coaching for a theater piece that involves storytelling and collecting stories. There's a lot of things like this, and it might sound kind of crazy and frenetic, but it is, and I like that.
yeah, that fits definitely. Well, let's first. I want to make sure we contact you if someone wants to reach out to you. Is there a good way to do that?
Absolutely. So the easiest way to find me is to on the internet is to find your favorite search engine and then just search my name, Adam Booth, and add storyteller, because if you don't, you'll get a boxer who lives in England. And you'll find me all over the place that way. But if you want to find me directly on the internet, you can go to my website, which is Adam and then a dash and then Booth. So adam-booth.com. And that's my website. And then my email address is adam-booth.com. If you're interested in the storytelling series that I run, the concert series, you can find me through that as well. And that is the Speak Story series in West Virginia. And the website for that is speakstoryseries.com.
Okay, definitely. No, I guess we should let the audience know that I have the privilege here this week. I'll be out at a festival to listen to Adam and to share with the whole storytelling festival and have my first experience at that. So I'm looking forward to that. And one of the ideas we have is hopefully have a conversation there, and maybe we'll reflect like a before and after the festival kind of and we may add that on to this recording or this interview. So looking forward to that.
It's pretty exciting. Yeah, because the thing that people can listen to. People talk about, an audience can listen to people talk about storytelling all day long, but until you experience it, you never get the full picture happening, So I'm looking forward to seeing you at the festival and, maybe talking after one of the sets.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess my last question here before we part is, where do you see the storytelling going? I guess the type of storytelling you're talking about, maybe just some of the other types of storytelling going in the future.
Well, I think we're entering a period of time, like I alluded to earlier, where we're going to hear a lot of traditional stories for lessons, for teaching, and for exploration. But I don't think personal stories are really going to go anywhere our way, because we're not where we really need those as well. Storytelling is such a hot term right now. If you really are attuned to it, you'll hear the word all over the place added to things. Film and storytelling, religion and storytelling, the workplace and storytelling, CEOs and storytelling. So it's all over the place. So, it's great that it's booming right now. For me, personally, where's my storytelling going? I have a lot of goals with the stories I want to create and the people I want to reach with them. I'm just really excited I love traveling, but in April I'm going to be the road for a while, and I'm looking forward to being here in my office and in the studio working on new pieces so that I can tour those around for people.
All right. Well, Adam, appreciate you spending time with us. It took us a little bit to get this together, and we're so grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm always appreciative when people want to know more. So thank you. Thanks for the interest.
And we'll be seeing you later on this week.
Yeah, look forward to it.
All right, thank you all for joining, and thank you, Adam, for spending time with us on StoryHinge. Again, if you want to reach out to Adam, you can connect at adam-booth.com or also find him at speakstoryseries.com. And those links will be on the website and on the podcast, as always. On this one, I want to reflect because I actually had a great opportunity. Shortly after this interview, I was able to go to a storytelling festival and hear Adam perform live. Multiple times, actually, throughout the weekend. And, I think on this, I want to just reflect a little bit on my thoughts about this traditional storytelling, the art form that Adam is engaged in. And, I guess the first thing I was just really, how do I want to frame this? I was blown away in a very real way in terms of the level of storytelling that I witnessed. And, I was thinking about this, how to explain this. And, I've been engaged in the personal stories through this podcast, and also on my own, I've been doing more storytelling, Moth type events, and we've all heard personal stories or people who could tell a good story throughout our lives. Maybe it was a family member, maybe a friend that seemed to have that ability, and there's to some degree we all know a good story, right? It's just part of our human nature to know what a good story is. We may not be able to describe the elements or how it works, but we know when it happens because we can resonate with it and we can feel that. And maybe it's because I have been engaged in the story analysis and research and storytelling in all its different forms that it gave me some perspective to see the art level at this festival. And my main thing I want to say is just I want to encourage you, if you have an opportunity wherever you're at, to look for this type of festival, the storytelling festival, and try to attend. And try to attend with your children, because the storytelling itself it's very touching, right? Because it's very human of us to be able to tell stories and tell each other stories. And it's a different level when you're live in the same room with somebody. And there was so much, I guess, touching humanity, I guess, out there that I felt with the storytellers and the different stories that they did share. And on the level of art, it reminded me of just taking the story to a different level than I had expected. I expected to hear some good stories, no doubt. But when I went there, I was like, wow, this is beyond what I expected. And maybe it's like this. For those of you who know how to play an instrument, even at a basic level or a sport, when you go and see high level performance or high level athlete performing, and you know some of that sport a little bit better, you can relate to how advanced and how good they are. And maybe that's kind of the effect I have, since I have been involved in stories, and to see these storytellers at that level was just phenomenal for me. And it's also maybe like writing, where you can read some good writing. And then poetry is writing as well, but it's trying to put the perfect words in the perfect places. And that's how this was. It was stories with all the basic story elements. Good beginning, good middle, good end, good themes, characters changing. Had all the basic story elements, but it also had the craft and the art on top of that. It had sometimes rhythm and rhyme, sometimes music. It had a dance and a flow with it. And there's several times I was just sitting there going, wow, this is so cool. Let me interject actually and tell you guys a few stories from the actual festivals to give you some sense of it. And I'm going to tell a couple ones about Adam. One of the nights he went up on stage to tell the story. So there's featured storytellers, at least at this event. And in the evenings, those featured storytellers each go up and tell a story. And Adam was one of those featured storytellers. So he gets up there and he says, I'm going to take a chance. He goes, I want to do something. And he actually has some explanation behind it. He said, he talked about how, the traditional way to start a story, the once upon a time, that rhythm. Then he also explained how the ending used to be like that, and happy ever after, and that the happily was a change to that, but it would have the same do. And he said, I'm gonna go ahead and try to tell a story with that same rhythm throughout it. And he did, and it had, like I said before, it had all the traditional story elements of a good story, but also throwing that rhythm in there and do, and it was beautiful and wonderful. And I'm like, wow, and that's an example of what I'm talking about. How I was like, wow, that's a whole nother level of storytelling. And I'll share another little. I went to Adam's workshops, one of the workshops that he had there, and he was using his knowledge of film and particularly cinematics and how the camera is positioned within film to give us the stories. And we're all familiar with watching movies and how the camera moves around a lot, and it's not hard for our brains to keep that story going, even though the camera does all these different things. Anyway, he gave us that background, and then he showed us how in our own storytelling that we can do that same thing. And it's, I can't explain it fully in this few minutes here, but I guess for me, basically what it did, it went from showing me that my storytelling went from 2D to 3D in this very real way, and that I could be descriptive and be able to bring the audience into the story more fully. And so this is a couple ones from Adam. So yeah, I guess a personal thanks to Adam for opening up my mind to a greater level of storytelling, to even giving me some tools and ideas about how to be a better storyteller. So again, I encourage you, if you have an opportunity to do that, to take that opportunity to hear stories at that level. All right, and with that, I think we're gonna wrap it up here today. I invite you, please subscribe, share the podcast with others if you're finding value here. We're going to continue to bring better stories into our lives. And, this is an exploration a bit for me as I've, gone through this podcast for a year and a half now, that, I'm learning a great deal about story and personal stories. And, I'm always looking for better ways to share that value with you out there, that you can find and create better stories in your own life. And again, I invite you also to go to the website, StoryHinge.com. And on the contacts page, we have a sign up for the newsletter. And I mentioned this before, but we're going to start bringing a newsletter out monthly that has, a deeper dive into story elements. And already put together and working on is the first one from Aristotle, to share with you about Aristotle's view on stories and some of his thoughts from many years ago. And, so with that, guys, have a great week, and we will catch you next week.